Well, I'm tremendously pleased now to introduce our first keynote of the two-day event. And of course, one of the pleasures of being involved in, I guess, a network like Access is thinking about who we might be lucky enough to invite to speak and contribute to this event. So I'm very pleased to invite Professor Martiskainen from the University of Sussex, who is involved in the Sussex Energy Group and the SPRU Science Policy Research Unit. And I've known of Mary's research for quite a long time now because we both work in the kind of energy social science space. And so some of us will be aware of the term fuel poverty already. Many of us may not be aware of the term transport poverty and also the important interconnections between them. And I believe that's what we might be about to hear more of. So over to you, please, Mary. Looking forward to it.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you for inviting me. I only came because you promised really good weather. But I live in Brighton, so it's not that much different. But it's really lovely to be here today, and it's really lovely to be in Exeter, and it's really great to be part of one of your events. I don't think I've actually been to the annual assembly before, but I know what Access is doing, and Patrick has already helped a lot with some of the work that I've been doing going forward as well. So, right, let's start.
Sorry, Mara,
okay, yes. So I am also, in addition to co-directing the Sussex Energy Group, I'm also the UKRI Energy Demand Research Champion, together with Professor Sarah Walker, who is at Newcastle University. And that means that we were invited to do a 5-year proposal for Energy Demand Research Centre, which is kind of continuing the work that CREDS, which is the Centre for Research into Energy Demand Solutions, has been doing for the last 5 years. And I've been part of CREDS as well, and particularly leading their equity and justice themes. So, but today I'm going to be focusing more on, how we have worked with specific partners in our project. So I'm not going to go deep into, what is fuel poverty or what is transport poverty, but I'm happy to talk about that over the next couple of days. So first of all, I just wanted to tell you, which you already probably all know, that, why do we actually need social science energy research? Why is it that we need to focus on social science approaches in energy in particular? And I have been an energy social science researcher for a really long time. But I remember when I started quite a few years ago now, the focus was very much, let's think about technology, let's think about technological solutions. And we still have that now quite a lot too, that, people are talking about these big energy projects all the time. And particularly, I like engineers, I work with a lot of engineers, but, they think that, technology is going to fix everything. But that doesn't necessarily always happen. So we need social science really to humanize the complex issue that energy particularly is. Sorry, I'm just going to see. Right, I think I'll do the enter pattern. And I think it's really important that we look at things like the lived experience, and particularly thinking about, what are the goal benefits in terms of, within our energy systems, and social science can help that in terms of thinking about, moving to renewables, having better air pollution reduction, for example. But I think it's also really important that we figure out, what are the injustices within our energy system. So, and that's something that we focus on energy research quite a lot too. And social science approaches can really also help us to figure out how policy works. And I like, Patrick, what you were saying, that it's not just a policy brief and, send it out there. But I think it's also really important to recognize that, how does policy not work in real life? And we as academics have this, really brilliant opportunity to actually, scrutinize some of these things. And I think it's also really important to, look at how policy decisions are made, who is making those decisions, where are they made, how are they made, who is actually being listened to, like Patrick, you mentioned about listening, who is actually left outside of all of these. So this is very much, kind of energy justice approach into thinking about. And it's very much what sort of shaped our thinking in the FAIR project as well. So this was a 3-year project that is still kind of ongoing. We have this, wonderful no-cost extension, which means that the project effectively never really ends until, one time there is a kind of deadline. But anyway, so the project has been funded by CREDS, and it's called Fuel and Transport Poverty in the UK Energy Transition, and particularly looking at this sort of academic concept of double energy vulnerability, which was developed by Robinson and Mattioli, and it's looking at where there are intersections when fuel poverty and transport poverty happen at the same time. So we have a lot of research already on fuel poverty in the UK, and people know that quite well. So you basically can't have either affordability reasons or access reasons. You don't have enough energy services at home, and there are different indicators how you measure fuel poverty in the UK. But I'm not going to go into that because that would be a whole other presentation. And then transport poverty is really about people not having the kind of transport access or transport links that they might need. So, for example, you might live in a city centre with really good bus access, but you can't afford to pay the bus bills, for example. So we wanted to look at, in this particular project, that, are there situations where people might be actually affected by both? And often, you hear that, well, isn't this just about poverty? Well, it's not just about poverty, because there are a lot of infrastructural issues, like, where are houses being built? What kind of transport networks do you have? And we think that, once we have a more sort of electrified energy system going towards net zero, we are going to see a lot more sort of linkages between energy and transport systems. So that was why we wanted to look at this. And we got funded by CREDS, and I wanted to just quickly tell you that actually, so I mentioned already that, fuel poverty research, there's a lot of that in the UK, but transport poverty is really something that isn't really recognised that much yet. It's a lot more recognised somewhere, like France, for example, has done quite a lot on that. And particularly, we wanted to find out who might be the people that might be vulnerable within a net zero energy transition, where they might be located, and why that might be the case. So, and I know Tracy from ESRC is here, so I didn't want to put ESRC on the spot, but this is, we actually did this research proposal back in 2017, so this shows the cycle of how, and I think everybody who does research knows this, that, you do one research proposal, and then the funders says, well, the reviewers say that actually, this is great, but no thank you. And at the time it was so funny, because I thought, well, actually, transport poverty, fuel poverty, this is something that is probably going to get solved in the next 2 years anyway. So, but the CREDS call came out, and they had this kind of challenges call, which is probably, they also have the flexible fund, but they had specific challenges calls, and they had a focus on equity. So it was kind of a perfect fit. And now I'm kind of getting more to the focus of the presentation. That for that particular call, I thought, well, we had already tried with, for one funder with an academic team only, that let's actually extend the team and bring some skills that we don't have, and actually bring some stakeholder partners along. So I invited Cambridge Econometrics, Energy Saving Trust, and Green Alliance to become like our stakeholder project partners. And the reason why we chose those, it wasn't just me doing this, this was a whole team of people, but I was the PI for the CREDS project. So I wanted to bring in specifically skills that we didn't have within our research team. So, for example, Cambridge Econometrics, they have this really amazing, really good economic model, which I don't really know that much about. I'm not a modeler myself, but I'm told that it's very well respected, and it's being used a lot in sort of policy making, and policymakers use that quite a lot as well. So they were able to bring this really good expertise in modelling, plus also the kind of policy networks that they have from their previous work that they've done. With Energy Saving Trust particularly, we were keen to have an organisation that has links with local networks and local helplines, particularly when we are trying to reach people that might be in fuel poverty or transport poverty. So we often use this term hard to reach, which I'm not that keen on in a way, because it puts people into like somehow living behind brick walls or something like that. But basically, it's a lot easier to go to then find research participants if you work with a local trusted organisation, for example. So via Energy Saving Trust, we were, for example, able to get some research participants that we identified that hadn't been researched before in this space, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. So, and also, they have really good networks with devolved administrations. So, for example, Energy Saving Trust has really good links in Northern Ireland and Wales and Scotland, and that was really important for our particular project, because this project was actually UK-wide. So we wanted to make sure that we don't just focus on England, that we actually look at all four nations as well. So And lastly, Green Alliance was able to bring these really established links with national government and policymakers. So, they actually have lots of civil servants at the end of the phone, which, academics don't always necessarily have. So it was really sort of thinking about, what are the kind of strategic skills and networks and benefits that these partners can bring to our projects. And they also all brought different approaches and their kind of different viewpoints in that sense. So in terms of how we designed the project, so it was an interdisciplinary and mixed methods research design. So we had like 7 different work packages in total. So we particularly wanted to look at who is at risk of double energy vulnerability, and we started with a really big literature review. So it's a systematic review, and that's been published a couple of years ago. And so basically looking at, where are fuel and transport poverty in the previous literature, what's happened, who's been doing what research on that in that space. We spoke to 59 households. We particularly wanted to hear people's lived experience, and I did some of that work as well. And I think just as a project PI, I think it's really important to do some of the data collection yourself so that you know the data. It's not just that, you're sending out your research fellows out there to do all the interviews. So. We've also done spatial analysis, so specifically looking at where there might be overlap between fuel poverty and transport poverty in the UK. And this particular piece of work was really quite difficult because there is no harmonised data available across the UK on fuel poverty stats or even transport poverty stats. I mean, UK doesn't even have an official transport poverty definition. So it was really, we had a really brilliant researcher, Amish Sabotra, who basically just looked at, how he could find harmonised data across the whole of the four nations. So, and that work actually has been submitted and is under review at the moment. And we also did policy analysis. So like I mentioned before, so, Cambridge Econometrics did specific sort of policy scenario modelling for us. And we've done national surveys, and we have done expert interviews, as well as focus groups. So all of our kind of work packages were designed to feeding one into another, and basically so that, we could first see what the research has been done in the past, to hear from people's lived experience, test that with kind of national surveys and look at how the spatial analysis goes, and then think about, what does it mean for policy particularly. And obviously, this was all going to be really lovely, beautiful, all of work in a flow, and then the pandemic happened and we had to kind of change things a little bit. So, for example, all our interviews with households were instead of being in person, they were all online or over the phone, so we had to change things quite dramatically. And I'm sure a lot of you have been in that same situation in the last few years. And particularly one thing, I apologise for the amount of text in this particular slide, but one of the things that we particularly wanted to take from the project is actually bring in the kind of lived experience that people have when they are experiencing both fuel poverty and transport poverty, and particularly thinking about, how we can actually then talk about this to policymakers particularly. So we had a lot of workshops with policymakers, and we had them in all different, all four nations. And one of the things that we brought to the presentations was examples like this. So, for example, Joe, the name has been changed for anonymity. I interviewed him, and he lives in Scotland, and he was talking about living in a big city with good transport links, but still not being able to, use the bus and having to walk everywhere, and particularly if it's, really cold winter weather and you have to walk everywhere outside, it's cold, you come home, your home is cold, you can't afford to heat your meals, so you're basically eating this cold meal all the time. And he was talking about, how he was kept alive by a charity who basically brought him sandwiches. And, this is not a new story in a sense. This is not something that we haven't heard before, but when we were presenting to policymakers in our policy roundtables, for example, one of our project partners, stakeholder partners, said that the stories like this in that setting were really powerful, that even though people might read this on the front page of a newspaper or in a newspaper story, it's very different than actually then having the academic there telling you about this. So we use these sort of lived experience sort of vignettes all throughout in our presentations when we spoke to policymakers, and that was something that we ran past with our partner stakeholders as well, just to make sure that we got the language right, etc. So one of the things really is kind of, thinking about then in a project like this, we really thought about that, how can we translate the more kind of academic research into these sort of more policy-facing reports. So, for example, Cambridge Econometrics did a report on the distributional effects of pathways to net zero and the implications for fuel and transport poverty. And it's quite a technical report, but it'll be something that, policymakers who have a very, very strong interest in modelling, they will read this. And when we did this particular report, we were able to then take some of the learning from our systematic review and from our sort of, household interviews, particularly that when Cambridge Econometrics were doing their scenario analysis, for example, we were able to say to them and say, well, we've interviewed these people and actually they are slightly different to what you might be suggesting. So it was kind of testing it all throughout. And then we had the benefit that Green Alliance were able to take this really technical report plus our interview sort of initial findings and our systematic review and put it into this sort of, nice report that policymakers, again, are very much more likely to be reading than any academic paper that we ever publish. And here, I think one thing is really important to say that, when you work with stakeholders, I mean, this report, it's the Green Alliance report. Yes, it has the GRETS branding on it. It's been written by Green Alliance, and I think us as academics have to sometimes let go in a way that, yes, it might not be cited by certain people in academia, but it's really important that some of our work actually gets out there in different types of format as well. So, and here I think it's really important to kind of think about the sort of outputs versus outcomes when you are thinking about particularly working with sort of stakeholder partners. So we've done a lot of outputs. So I think we have about 15 papers. I'm sure there's at least another three or four in under review or coming through. We've done blogs, several consultation responses. With the consultation responses, for example, someone like Energy Saving Trust was doing a lot of consultation responses, and every single response that they did, they were able to put in our report in there. So that was another kind of extra dissemination network for us. We've done a podcast. I recorded my first ever podcast with Green Alliance. I'm one of those people who doesn't like podcasts. I'm sorry, I don't really. For some reason, I just think it's just a radio show, but not live. But anyway, we did a podcast with Green Alliance, and apparently it has a lot of listens, and it was a really great thing to do. And we were able to again use their sort of established podcast to do this. So we've done a lot of outputs, but then actually thinking about, well, what are the outcomes from our project? And it's actually probably only going to be a few small lines in the end that is going to be the kind of impact that our funder might be looking at in a way. So, for example, we have been advising EU on transport poverty research, and this is quite interesting because in the project, we wanted to focus particularly on both fuel poverty and transport poverty, and specifically on this double energy vulnerability. But because the way policy works in a way that, here's energy and here's transport, the policy world isn't necessarily looking at this like this at the moment yet. Apart in Scotland, they are talking about it in Scotland. But a lot of the time people are still looking at, well, here's transport and here's energy, whereas we are trying to kind of bring them together a bit more. So anyway, we've been connecting with key policymakers. We have had citations in key documents. So for example, the really big Chris Skidmore review cites both the Cambridge Econometrics reports and the Green Alliance reports. Not any of the academic papers that we've done, but the actual two reports, which is really good. And actually, one of the kind of original aims when we were thinking about what's the kind of impact that we might want to have with the project was particularly thinking about that. Even though I said before that we want to think about energy and transport together, but transport poverty is something that we were really sort of keen to have out there in the policy discourse, and it's mentioned now, for example, in that report. I've had quite a lot of invitations to go and talk on transport poverty, even though I'm an energy researcher, so I feel a little bit like, out of my spot. So I often say, go and speak to one of my colleagues like Giulio Mattioli, who was on the project, because he's the transport expert. But I think the kind of fact that we have visibility for the term and visibility and the realization that actually not everyone is going to be having an EV plugged into their home with a solar panel on the roof when we move to net zero, that there are actually people that are really struggling, even basic things like getting to work or getting to the place of education because of transport issues. So, and just thinking about sort of additional outcomes that I think really important from this project is the kind of capacity that we've been building. And I wanted to mention two colleagues in particular. So I mentioned Amish already, that he was doing a lot of our sort of spatial analysis work. And he was actually hired to go and work for, which was then BASE, but is now DESNES. So he actually now has a role at DESNES working in fuel poverty. It's always a shame when a really great academic, early career goes and works in, they get poached into sort of, policy work. But at the same time, it's really great because, it's the kind of opportunity for them to actually, take some of the things that we've learned in the project and hopefully take it forward in their work. And similarly, Kirsten Jenkins, who is at the University of Edinburgh, she was selected to be on the Scottish Government's Fuel Poverty Committee, and she's writing a report with them. So, that was something that I encouraged her. I said, please apply for this role. I'm sure you will get it, and she did get it. So it's really great that she's had that. So, and Amish particularly I asked Amish to, to give feedback after he left the project, to sort of, what it was like working for that, any kind of feedback. And basically he said that, despite being one of the kind of junior members, the fact that he had opportunities to present in sort of, various policy events, etc., gave him a lot of expertise and a lot of experience that was then really helpful. So I think one key outcome for our project is that we didn't only bring these external sort of partners to the project, but also our early career researchers were then able to work with them and find out a bit more about, how is it when you go and work with a policymaker in a policy roundtable, for example, or something like this. And I always say to every colleague that when I speak to about early careers, that if you are going, particularly if you are a more senior professor or senior researcher or in a more senior role and you get invited to these meetings with policymakers, always take a junior member with you, because there's so much tacit knowledge that you just can't learn other than being in the room. So I think that's really important message there too. And in terms of thinking about, what worked really well in this sort of, bringing the sort of non-academic partners on the project. So, like I said before, we had these additional skills. We acquired a lot of networks, and particularly, thinking about sort of policymakers and, research participants that we were able to reach. So, for example, in our systematic review, we identified that there is a lot of lack of research with people from ethnic minorities or people with disabilities, and through Energy Saving Trust, we were able to reach some people, for example, from a charity that works with refugees and recent migrants. So that was really, really good in terms of bringing those networks in. I think we also thought about more how we talk about our research, because we had to leave some of the academic jargon behind a little bit and think about how do we actually talk about research in terms of when we go to meetings with policymakers, for example. I think it's also been a benefit that we have had a lot of our findings translated to different audiences. So I mentioned a podcast, we've done blogs, various different outputs. This kind of having these sort of established blogs and podcasts that Green Alliance, for example, has, that was really beneficial for us. And obviously, our funder and our Centre Gretz has blogs as well. But I think, the more you can put your work out there, the better, really. And I mentioned the consultation responses already that ESD did, which was really good. And I think, one of the things I do think that, the building capacity for early career researchers is really, really important. And I'm glad that Gerardo is here also as part of Access, because he's been working on the FAIR project, so that's really good. And I also asked our stakeholders that, what did they think that worked really well? So, for example, one of our partners said that, it was the first project leading to a contribution to an academic project. So it was a real learning curve. Apparently, our style of working was much more relaxed than the usual consultancy. And apparently, because of that, the work felt less intense, which is quite interesting because, I think in academia, we often feel like we are having really intense work all the time, but actually we don't necessarily have the same kind of time pressures than maybe a consultancy might have. Apparently, we were quite flexible with deadlines, which again, this is something that can be kind of. But okay, we were in the middle of a pandemic for a lot of this, so we had to change deadlines. But I'm glad that this meant reduced stress and actually allowed time to think problems more thoroughly, which is something that we certainly in academia benefit from, and that's something that we should be really grateful for. Apparently our team meetings were much more casual. I never wear a suit, so maybe that's why. But apparently this also allowed the team spirit to build up. So I really like the fact that this is something that they felt was really nice about our project in that sense. And this is from somebody else, hence the different colors. So basically having access to the latest academic thinking is apparently really beneficial for a lot of stakeholder partners. And obviously, being able to participate in a kind of collaborative process and produce recommendations for further policy or research. And Patrick also asked me to think about that, what are the things that could have worked better. So I think in terms of, from my point of view as a PI, I think thinking about the timing of stakeholder involvement as project partners particularly is really important. So, in a 3-year project, we had the partners involved from day one, but then their outputs were only coming maybe later on. So, I think it's really important to think about when is the most beneficial time for partners to be involved. Definitely check any legal issues. We had a really, really long process of getting a data sharing agreement through Sussex University with one of our partners, and university legal departments can sometimes be take longer than a peer review. So just to be certain about that any kind of legal contracts and stuff like that. I didn't actually even think about that before. We didn't actually really, when we were putting the project together, we didn't really think about this, and it wasn't really brought up that much until we started doing the data collection. And then it's like, oh, hang on a minute, we need this data sharing agreement. So it's really important to check those. I think it's also really important to be targeted with meetings, particularly, some project partners might be, particularly if they are charities, they might have really limited time. So thinking about how, what kind of meetings you have. Unexpected events, I mentioned the pandemic already, but we also had some staff changes, and we had staff changes within our project partners as well. So, once you start building those relationships, then somebody leaves, then somebody else comes in. What does it mean in terms of your project going forward? And I think it's really important to be clear in expectations. And I think for me, particularly now thinking about if I was putting this project together, again, now at this stage, I think it's really important to also to think about what kind of outcomes the sort of project partners want, and it's not going to be these sort of really high-ranking journal articles, for example, or citations in Nature Energy or something like that. So I think it's really important to think about what they want, and it's also really important to recognize that they will have their own agendas, and their agendas are going to be different probably to your academic ones to some extent. And then I asked also our partners that, what could have been working better, and apparently, again, clear requirements is really important. And I think particularly some stakeholder partners are much more used to, someone coming to them and say, we need a report on this, can you do it now? Whereas in academia, it tends to be particularly the type of research that I do, which is very much looking at, what does the data tell us kind of thing. Let's do interviews and find patterns and themes and find out what's going on. It's very difficult to then to go, well, can you tell me, beforehand, how is, for instance, fuel or transport going to influence somebody's life? So I think it's really important also to recognize these sort of things that, what are the kind of requirements for the project. We also gave quite a lot of free rein to our sort of partners in terms of, defining their research questions and how to answer them, but they found it quite challenging. So I think they probably would have wanted a bit more structured sort of, here's the research question, this is what how you'll find it. And apparently it would have been helpful if I would have acted more as a client, which is, again, I don't consider myself ever as a client in terms of in academia, that's kind of that more of a consultancy. But I think this goes anyway to the things like, expectations. What do you want from your project partners? What kind of requirements you have for them? And again, thinking about, this sort of collaboration. So, for example, how do you actually make sure that you are actually doing truly collaborative work? And is it sort of, me just saying that, well, could you write a report on this? Or what does this data tell you and for your model, etc.? So I think we could have, even though it did feel like we did a lot, it still seems like we could have done a lot more also. Yes, so just, the thinking about in terms of structures and collaborations. And we had a lot of what I call these sort of sisters. There are several projects that, academics tend to have one project and then another one that is kind of linking and then another one and another one. So one of our project partners said that it would have been really good to be involved in some of or find out a bit more about the other work going on. And I think that's a really good point there too. And obviously, everyone is limited and with time. And so, for this particular partner, the time commitments would have been good to have a bit more on that. So just to conclude, how am I doing for time?
There's very little time.
This is my last.
Questions, Mary.
This is my last slide. Yeah. Sorry, just very quickly. Okay, so just wanted to say that key conclusions from the research. So our research shows that double energy vulnerability worsens the quality of life for many people. So people actually have to choose between whether I use energy today or transport tomorrow. There are lots of spatial aspects, and I'll be happy to talk to you about this. And there's lots of papers that I can share with you if you are interested. I think in terms of having the stakeholder partners, it really brought a lot of benefits in terms of having access to research participants, having access to policymakers, having access to sort of additional communication channels, and particularly thinking about the building capacity part. And I do think that we did think about a lot more about what do our findings mean for the world outside of academia. And I think that was really sort of benefit that we actually had really experienced stakeholder partners that are really sort of good at doing policy recommendations. So the policy recommendations that we did from our work actually felt more tested in a way and kind of more sort of real in that sense. And I do think that, collaboration with anybody, whether it's an academic or particularly, non-academic partners, it needs time, it takes effort, and I think it's really important to be clear in your expectations. And as Patrick said, listen to everyone and what everyone needs. So thank you so much. And it's been a real team effort. So thanks, everyone. Sorry if I overrun.
Well, I mean,
we have a couple of minutes.
We're running about 10 minutes late.
Oh, okay.
But that's not your fault in a sense. I mean, I think we have 5 or 10 minutes for a coffee break. I suggest, well, you're here for the next 2 days.
Yes, I'm here. Yes, yeah.
Okay, so Mary is available for questions. We don't have time, unfortunately, to ask lots of questions now, even though I'm sure.
Maybe one or two?
I think one, maybe.
One.
And then we move on.
Yeah, okay, that's good.
And I know there's people online, and they'll be frustrated, but if you write questions, there are other ways to connect up with Mary, and then they can happen through the email address you can see on the screen. So do code those questions and ask them, but we definitely don't have time to have too many of them now. But yeah, if we've got maybe one in the room, we could take that.
Yeah. There's one over there. There's one over here. I'm sure we can take two.
Okay, so Clive Mitchell from Nature Scott. I was interested, you mentioned food a couple of times in relation to cold meals and walking to buy food and so on. And I'm just wondering whether there are kind of any insights you got from the research in relation to food poverty and the overlaps between energy, transport and food poverty and having to make choices between those. And that also potentially being a barrier to the transition to net zero in terms of food systems.
Yes, thank you. Yes, definitely. And that's something that came up really strongly, and particularly people coming from different cultures and people wanting to, for instance, cook food from their own culture. And I spoke to quite a few people who said that, well, I want to cook specific food, and to get that I need to take the bus, but I can't afford to take the bus because the bus fare is too expensive. Similarly, I spoke to a father who wanted to treat his children into a takeaway meal every now and then, but he couldn't afford to take his children to the local, McDonald's or something like that. So what he used to do, he would take the bus and then bring the food home for the children. So food did feature a lot, and that was something that we found people were talking about that a lot. And there is that question that is this poverty across food, energy and transport, etc. But I think what differentiates it is that particularly with energy and transport, it's such an infrastructural thing that we are talking about housing quality, we are talking about lack of transport links, etc. So, but food is definitely something that is featured. And since we've done the interviews, inflation has gone up a lot, and so people are probably now even in a worse situation in a lot of ways.
Right, thank you very much indeed, Mary. That was fantastic, really thought-provoking. And as I said, Mary will be around,